Okay, thanks for coming up. You are at the 10 biggest F-ups from DrinkBox Studios. We have a half an hour, so we're going to go pretty quick. This will be fast, this will be furious. So with that said, let's get going. First off, who are we? We are DrinkBox Studios. So that means we are these people. We were founded in 2008. We're based out of Toronto, Canada. We have 5 games so far under our belt. I'm Chris, and this is Graham.
Hello.
So we're both here to do this talk because we figured half the F-ups really are best spoken to by me, and then half are best spoken to by Graham. So you're going to be hearing from both of us, and I guess our positions would probably help to why we're speaking to this. Graham, you're more producer biz dev, I guess?
Yes.
And I would say I'm more designer or PR marketing stuff. Okay, so what have we done? Good question. First game was Tales from Space about a blob. Next game was Tales from Space meeting Blobs Attack, followed by Guacamelee, Guacamelee Super Turbo Championship Edition, and currently we're finishing up Severed, which we're hopefully submitting this week, maybe next week. And I would say the 10 F-ups really have been drawn upon our experiences for the production of these games. And the theme which you might start to see is a lot of these F-ups are pretty obvious in hindsight, and that they don't necessarily have to do with game development, and they seem really small problems that had we addressed them at the time, it wouldn't have been so bad. But they all manifested into be much larger problems that cost us way more time and energy had we not just dealt with them originally. Okay. And with that said, I'll hand it over to Graham.
All right, so we're presenting these kind of in loose chronological order. So this one happened really early on in the company's life cycle. It was actually the first year that we had to file for taxes with Canada Revenue. We had started building up the team, paying people small salaries, and we were trying to take advantage of Canadian tax credits that are available to us. So there's a number of consultants and companies that help you apply for some of these tax credits. The one in particular that we were trying to apply for was the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Credit, or SR&ED as it's called usually. So, Canadian companies, I'm sure some of you will probably get emails all the time, like we can help you prepare your shred credit for a percentage of the rebate. So we met with one of these people, probably maybe one of the first people who emailed us at a coffee shop. He seemed trustworthy, seemed very knowledgeable. So we said, okay, we signed a contract with him, and then he started encouraging us to claim pretty much all of our employees' time as scientific research. He seemed like he knew what he was doing. We trusted him. He's the subject matter expert. He said, companies do this all the time. You're a small company. And he actually did convince us that, game development is, experimental development. So we took his advice. We submitted our taxes with his help. And a few weeks later, we got a letter from Canada Revenue Agency basically saying, hey, you guys are being audited. So this is a letter you never want to receive. So we got audited, our account got red flagged. We ended up firing that consultant and started working with a better company. But really we could have avoided all of that if we had simply asked other people, like, who are you using to help you with your shred credits, and getting referrals. Since we didn't take the time up front to do that work, and we just kind of went with the easiest path, we ended up getting really screwed and really spending a lot of time sending stuff to the government and doing these audits for 2 years. We were sending them paperwork and wasted a huge amount of time just for not doing a little bit of legwork up front.
I blame you for that.
That's my fault.
That's totally your fault. Workplace comfort is important. Yeah, so it's a small studio. You want to save money where you can. So not obviously, we get a workspace that's pretty cheap. Maybe the word affordable is more appropriate. And consequently, what happens is we don't have central AC, and our heating's done through very old radiators that don't work, and we don't have control over them. So what happens in the early days is, in the summer, our studio would get above 100 Fahrenheit. And this is the temperature in the studio. And of course, in the winter, we had clocked internal temperatures of under 20 Fahrenheit. And this is just no place for people to concentrate and work. You lose a lot of person hours. We had to send people home when it got below 20 Fahrenheit. And that's not a very good way to make a game. And so we did a lot of Band-Aid solutions. We would buy the small AC units you get at Walmart. We would get space heaters for people, but still, it wasn't cutting it. People had a tough time concentrating. They were wrapped in snowsuits at the studio. So we were big people, and we bought industrial-sized AC units that also act as heaters. We got blinds to actually address the problem. Had we just done it earlier, we would have saved a lot of headache. And to continue on, we have one toilet at the studio. And no one's really assigned to toilet duty, so you know how it starts, right? You start flushing and it starts going slower and the water starts to rise and no one's dealing with it. Everyone ignores it, elephant in the room. Sooner than later, it's overflowing into the studio itself and employees have to walk down to the Starbucks and you're just losing hours of work. So we ended up calling a plumber, but had we just done that in the beginning, we would have missed out on the chaos that ensued in the office, and we would have avoided losing all those hours. So for me, the take-home message is we've learned the hard way that a key to our success is really ensuring the atmosphere is decent at work so people can be happy, they can be motivated, and they can be creative. It seems pretty simple, but it's actually a pretty big one for us.
Okay, so around the time that we were getting ready to release our first game about a blob, we asked a third party, I won't say who it was, who we trusted for advice on the launch date. And they told us the launch date, and we said, okay, that's the date. And we sent out a press release, and we made a trailer with the date, and we kind of really locked ourselves into the date. And then a couple weeks later, we started learning about other games that were going to come out on that same date. Bionic Commando Rearm 2, Plants vs. Zombies, Explodamon. Stacking was actually going to be the first PlayStation Plus free game that they were giving out. So we found out about all of these things, and we were like, oh man, we're screwed. What can we do? And it felt like we talked about, could we move the date? We felt like there was too much materials out there already with the date. So we said, okay, let's see what happens. And then what happened was, About a Blob came out and really didn't have any bump. It was like a pretty flat curve. Usually you expect a big spike on your launch day, but we were like, nobody had heard of us as a studio. It was a really poor choice for a launch date. Comparing to something like Guacamelee, this is more what you want to see when you launch your game. Now Guacamelee, we were much more careful with the launch date for Guacamelee. But there's a lot of other factors in this graph, so it's not exactly a fair comparison. Like, we did a lot better marketing with Guacamelee. But really, the takeaways here are try and be proactive and strategic when you're choosing your dates. And also be flexible and willing to move things around. Like, another example is with Severed. We're going through this right now. We were thinking to try and launch Severed on May 10th. And then Uncharted 4 decided they're going to shift their date into May 10th. So we're like, okay, thank God we didn't announce that, because now we have this flexibility, we can move around. Yeah.
Spoiler, May 10th, we're shipping. It's not true. Use your PR company. That's a strong statement, I guess. So when we started, we made this internal metric at the studio sort of to evaluate our return on investment for going to expos. So you go to expos to show off your game. And this internal metric that we use is we take the cost of going to a show and we divide it by the number of articles that appear on the internet from media coming by. So you get this cost per article. And when we started off, we were an unknown company and we had a lot of trouble having media come by the booth, so we didn't get a lot of stories written about us. And you can see here, early on in 2010 and 2011, for every article that was posted on the internet about our game, it basically cost us about $1,000, which is not very efficient. So we weren't sure what to do, and we looked across the aisle at one of the shows, and we saw someone else having a ton of media come through, and we asked them, what do you do? They say a PR company, a light bulb goes off. And I think we had thought about using a PR company, but for some reason I think we felt we were too small, maybe too indie, maybe we thought it was too much money. But we hired one, and immediately after, for our following shows, the cost per article went way down. And this is really a result of having way more media come by and check out the game, so having way more articles written about the game. And I'll say a few footnotes to this, that I think now that we're more established, it maybe isn't as important to hire a PR company anymore, or maybe, I think it's something you can evaluate, but again, when you're not established, for us, it did wonders. And the other thing I'll say is, you don't want to be spending $1,200 per article, unless maybe it's on a huge website and it's on the front for the week or something. So that's what I would say. But for us, the take-home message really was, sometimes it sounds cheesy, but it takes money to make money, and the cost of hiring the PR company was easily made up for by the additional sales of our game. So if you do the numbers, it's actually kind of a no-brainer to a certain extent. Yeah.
All right, choose your ports wisely. So our second game, Mutant Blobs Attack, was a Vita launch title, and so that came out early 2012. If you're not familiar with the game, it made heavy use of the tilts. There were some levels where you control your character by tilting. Use the touchscreen to move platforms around. It's a puzzle platformer, so to reorient platforms, you use the touchscreen. So it was really well suited for the Vita, because the Vita supports those features. And then we launched the game on Vita. It did really well. We were really happy, but we started talking about, how can we, try and squeeze some additional royalties out of this game? Is there, can we bring it to additional platforms? So we started talking about how would it work on PC? Well, maybe we can use the mouse to move the platforms around. And the tilt levels, well, maybe we can just use the keyboards to move the character around. So it's not as well suited, but it'll work. And then we started talking about consoles, and we're like, okay, so there's no mouse on consoles. Maybe we can just try and use the thumbsticks to move things around. So it's like the experience is a little bit worse now. So we did it. We shipped on PC, and then shortly later we shipped on consoles. And you can see from the Metacritic scores that what seems pretty obvious, the less well-suited your game is to a platform, the lower scores you're going to receive, because it's not a great experience on those other platforms. Also, when you have lower scores, you usually get lower sales. And while the ports to these other platforms were a little bit profitable, maybe it's not really worth the damage it might do to your company's reputation or your average Metacritic score. So, after we did this, we kind of decided internally, let's not do this again. Let's try and really just bring our games to places where they're well-suited to be. And when we released Guacamelee, we're getting tons of emails from people, hey, let us bring your game to mobile. And we're like, oh, how's that going to make sense? Like, we use every single button on the controller. How are you going to map that to a screen that doesn't have any buttons? And so we just outright turned it down. Even though we think we could have made some money on that platform, the experience would be so bad. So really the lesson learned here is that money is not always everything. Like reputation and customer trust is very important.
Yeah. Buffer time for your buffer time. So earlier in the studio's life, we wanted to try to, when we went to shows to show off the game, we would try to spend as much time on the game up until the show, and we really didn't want to waste time traveling to the show. We wanted to try to minimize travel time. So that worked out most of the time, up until a fateful PAX, which was in Seattle, and we're based in Toronto, that the plan was to get into Seattle the day before, early afternoon, which plenty of time to set up your booth, get ready, yada yada, and we were going to get there via Calgary. And we had said to ourselves, well, look, even if we miss our connecting flight, Calgary is a fairly international airport. There's a gazillion flights in North America. We'll have no problem catching a plane to get to Seattle. And of course, that didn't work out. We missed our connection, and the next flight wouldn't get us in until 2 days later. So that would be 2 days into the show. Completely unacceptable. So what do you do in the middle of Calgary? You leave the airport, walk across the street, rent a car, and you drive overnight through the Northwest United States to get to Seattle at 8:30 in the morning when you have a 9 a.m. Interview. Pros to this is the sunrise in Montana is pretty awesome. Cons, when your programmer Alex starts to fall asleep and pulls over into a parking lot, the car gets attacked by dogs. That's a 100% true story. And probably the saddest aspect of it is you're really tired for your first interviews. This is our first interview. It's Graham with Polygon, and he's a very sad, pale-looking individual. More pale than usual. And so for us, really, what we do now is we give ourselves a full working business day before anything we have to do, just because things will go wrong, and they will go wrong. For us, the take-home really is, again, it's about return on investment. It's important to show up, but it's also really important to show up fresh, so you can really showcase what your company has to offer. And for us, that's worth much more than getting in those last few hours of work.
All right. Handle side projects carefully. This is probably one of the most painful and stressful things that we had to go through at DrinkBox. So we started the company in 2008, and we borrowed with permission like a very standard boilerplate contract from one of our previous companies. And I'm sure many of you have signed something like this in the past. It has a clause in there that basically everything you do at work or outside of work is owned by the company. So while we had people sign this, as we were building up our team, we knew people were coming into the team and they had already started working on some project, and they were asking us, is it okay if I continue working on this project? So we started having discussions about side projects. Should we allow this? And we came to the conclusion that there's a lot of advantages to let people work on things outside of work. It lets them be creative, experiment with other ideas, things that are different from what you're working on internally. And in theory, that will improve them. That'll improve their skills, and they'll bring those skills back to DrinkBox and help improve DrinkBox's games. Major risk is that there's this chance for conflict of interest. So we really trusted our employees, maybe too much so. We gave them a lot of rope. We didn't ask too many questions about their side projects, and we let them work on their side projects. And then a number of problems started happening. For example, people were calling in sick because they were crunching on their game before an IGF deadline. People were coming into work exhausted because they had worked too late into the night on their side project. People were putting together prototypes and applying to the same competitive government grants that we were applying to. Holding back ideas, saving ideas for their own games or for the project they're working on, rather than contributing them to DrinkBox's games. Some people we even caught working on their side projects during work hours, like having a chat window open with someone else who was also working on the project. So this resulted in a couple of people being fired, and we had to really take a step back and reevaluate, should we allow side projects? So what we ended up doing, we decided that the major issue here was the fact that we didn't know enough about their projects, and they didn't know enough about what constitutes a conflict of interest or what would be a problem with DrinkBox. So we went back to our initial employment contract, and we added an additional clause, which basically says that DrinkBox has to sign off on your side project. So what this did was it encouraged a dialogue between us and our employees. We learned about their side project. We were able to think about, will this be competitive with DrinkBox? We kind of laid the ground rules for people. If you're going to work on your side project, this is what we expect. And we continue letting people work on their side projects, and there hasn't been any issues since then.
Yeah, beware hidden costs. So I would say this point, maybe this F-up applies more to smaller devs, so keep that in mind. So as you go to expos and you go to shows, you need to rent equipment to show your game off. And we were pretty naive in the beginning, and we would rent from the show organizers themselves. And as you can see in the first column, things are pretty expensive when you rent from the show organizers. So for example, at least in this example, a 50-inch TV was $900 to rent for a 3-day weekend, which is pretty intense. So a few shows in advance, I thought I was getting smart, and I spent a lot of time finding an external rental company that was much cheaper, and they promised me, no problem, we can totally bring the equipment into your booth, we do this all the time. I talked to the show organizers, they had no problem with this, I signed contracts, we went back and forth, I crossed my T's, I dotted my I's, and things were looking good until, for this particular show, we got hit for $2,400 for drayage fees. And just a quick background on drayage, what drayage is. you bring your equipment to the door of the booth, or of the expo hall, and unions will take it, let's say, 100 feet to your booth, and they'll charge you a lot of money for this. Now, $2,400 probably isn't a lot if you're a bigger dev putting on bigger booths. It's probably a drop in the bucket. But for a smaller company like us, especially then, that's a huge amount of money to get burnt with. So what do we do now? Generally speaking, we buy our equipment wherever we go. So we'll go to the Best Buy or the Target, and this is easier than ever because there's Uber and it's super simple. Sometimes we'll just give the TV away at the end of a show because it's even cheaper to do that than rent it. Sometimes if we drive to a show, we'll actually bring the TVs back with us to use in the studio or to raffle off. And this has worked pretty well. I think for us, really, there's no clear-cut answer here, actually. So the take-home message for us is every dollar counts, but you got to be careful, first off, what you're spending your money on, but you also have to be careful not to waste too much time trying to save money, because in the end, that costs a lot of money itself. So for us, it's really about just evaluating on a case-by-case basis, looking at the show, looking at your needs, and kind of thinking outside the box with what is most appropriate for you.
Okay, QA patches thoroughly. So shortly after we released Guacamelee, we plan to do a pretty small downloadable content patch which would allow you to change your costumes inside of the game. Changing your costumes also had some gameplay implications, but it's a relatively small patch that we were doing for this DLC pack. Now, we released it on a Tuesday in SEA, and immediately saw on Twitter people are having this issue where when they change into a chicken, they can't change back out of a chicken. If you're not familiar with the game, sometimes you change into a chicken. But people were getting stuck as a chicken, and then basically it's a blocking issue. You can't progress through the game. And we started getting tons of emails from people. I'm stuck as a chicken. Threw the studio into a panic mode. We contacted Sony. They pulled down the patch. But still, like hundreds of people who had grabbed the patch during that time, they were affected. The fix was a relatively simple thing once we found it, but the problem was, you have to go through certification with a patch, and that takes a couple of weeks. So the people who were affected were really, their choices were to wait for a few weeks, don't play the game for this fix to come through, or start the game over, and both of those are not good things. So I guess we had really underestimated. The problem really came down to the fact that we didn't test this particular case where if they had a save game at this certain spot in the game and they patched, then their save game would be affected in this negative way. Basically what we learned here was that QAing a patch is a very expensive time commitment, because there's a lot more cases that can happen out in the wild for people who have partial progress through the game. And when the game changes underneath it, you have to make sure you're handling all those cases. So now we're much more careful about this. We have much more complex test matrices for patches, and we're much more aware of that the QA of patches can be even more work than the QA of the initial release. And so anytime we're patching now, we really plan like a long time period for QA.
Where are we at? Oh yeah, this one. Stay cool. So, whoops, that's a spoiler. So let's see. 3 or 4 years ago, we sent out an email to some selected media contacts we had, basically giving them an update on what DrinkBox is doing. So we like to do this sometimes, kind of just drop in, say hello. And this was a confidential email, although we weren't very clear about it. And essentially we were talking about how we might be doing a new guac for Super Turbo Championship Edition, and maybe even mentioning Severed. And unfortunately, it was posted as a news article. Someone didn't notice it was supposed to be confidential, and again, it wasn't very clear it was confidential, so that's on us. But unfortunately, it was posted as a news article on IGN. And so we immediately called them, and to their benefit, or to the awesomeness of them, they pulled it down right away. But this is the internet, and of course it got picked up by some other media outlets. And while this is happening, a very, very large media outlet contacted us and said, hey guys, what's up? What's going on? Do you have any comments about this leaked info that we think we saw? And I said, well, no, it's just nothing, just ignore it. And then they came back and said, well, we're actually going to post about it. And so at this point, you get kind of angry and you get kind of pissed. You say to yourself, man, if they post this information, they are jeopardizing our business. They're potentially making us lose sales. You get sort of angry. But for us, we took a moment, we thought about it, and we said, hey, look, they're just trying to do their job. The mess up was actually our fault, not theirs. And I think we did a pretty good job. So we ended up talking to them and met them halfway, where they agreed to post half the information, so about Super Turbo Championship Edition, but they'd hold back the other information, which was actually the announcement for Severed, and it hadn't been announced at that point. And for me, actually, the take-home message of this is, so I will say, we have a great working relationship with these people still. And for me, the take-home message was, when things kind of get shitty, it almost rarely helps to get angry on the internet or get angry at people, even though it's what you really want to do. You have to remember there's going to be business relationships a year down the road, 2 years down the road, and you really have to be careful sacrificing any of these. So really the take-home message is just stay calm when things go wrong, and I didn't mean for that to rhyme. Oh yeah, this is our email exchange. I don't know if I mentioned that, but you probably read that. So with that said, yeah, so this is basically the summary of everything we went through. You can kind of see, again, I'll just quickly talk about the theme real brief, was that a lot of these were small problems that had we just dealt with them immediately or put a bit of time into the initial issue, they wouldn't have transformed to this monster problem. Yeah, and I think with that, we're done. And don't forget to fill out your forms. That's the thing I'm supposed to tell you. Okay.
And if anyone has any questions, we can take a few at the microphones.
Oh, yeah. Good point. Thanks.